Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm Ian.
And I'm not.
What? That's right. Ordinarily, this is a podcast where me and my friend Ian watch a film and read the comic on which it is based in order to get him to read more comics. This episode, however, Ian is moving house, so I am joined by very special guest host, John. This episode, John and I have both watched and read Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, an autobiographical work about the author's time growing up in Iran during the Islamic Revolution, and we're going to be discussing them with an authority that only two white men can provide. But first, who is this enigma of a man that simply goes by the name John? Let's find out. John.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm doing a good job of not being Ian.
Well, it's a bit early to tell so far, but we'll see. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for filling in Ian's absence.
Thank you for inviting me.
I thought we could start by getting to know you a little bit and your familiarity with comic books. So, well, let's start there. What is your familiarity with comic books and comic book related properties?
So, obviously, when I was a kid, avid reader of the Funday Times, which was the insert in the Sunday Times for children, and they had Beryl the Peril, which is my earliest recollection of being into comics. Mm-hmm. And then when I was a teenager, I got super into the Marvel Ultimate Universe, so kind of Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, all that stuff, and probably read about the first 6 trade paperbacks of Spider-Man before kind of putting that down again. And it was that period that I read stuff like Sandman, Preacher, V for Vendetta, like the kind of classic DC Vertigo titles.
Yeah.
And then I kind of fell off the wagon through like much of my 20s until Disney bought Lucasfilm and Star Wars went back to Marvel. So I got myself a Marvel Unlimited subscription, started reading all the Star Wars comics, and then kind of branched off into reading stuff like Ironheart and Ms. Marvel and kind of some of that newer Marvel content. So mostly on the Marvel side, but also some dabbling in the DC Vertigo titles from yesteryear.
Yeah. So that's actually quite similar to my experiences, although I did have a very DC heavy chunk of my life. I just dabble in those titles nowadays. And I think actually what you just described there is quite common, to read comics at quite a young age, go away in those sort of late teens, early 20s, and then come back to them. I think more often than not, when I speak to people about comics, even the most avid readers have always had a period where they've gone away and then come back.
Yeah.
And that can be quite daunting. But you say you started with the Star Wars ones again.
Yeah, so that was exactly it. I started reading Star Wars and Darth Vader when they came onto Marvel Unlimited, and then when I ran out of Star Wars comics, I was like, because Ironheart had just started, the second volume of Ms. Marvel had just started, and the first volume had been nominated for a Hugo Award, so I read a lot of Ms. Marvel as well. And then Miles Morales gets mentioned in Ms. Marvel, so I start reading Miles Morales, and then and the crossovers, they got me with the crossovers. It's almost like it was a joined up business decision or something. Now I read loads of Marvel superhero comics. I don't know how that happened.
That's how they get you.
Yeah.
So do you remember you said there, the Funday Times, that was your first interaction with comic books?
Yeah, definitely.
Does it still exist nowadays?
I don't know. I don't get the Sunday Times, and I've not lived with my parents for long enough that I don't know whether Funday Times is still a key component. If you have any listeners that are avid Sunday Times readers, they should write in and let us know.
They should let us know what Beryl the Peril is up to nowadays.
Yeah. And she was, I think, a dandy character that they reprinted in the Funday Times. So through that, I kind of got into the Beano and the Dandy as well. But everyone read the Beano and the Dandy, right?
Was she the sort of equivalent of, was it Minnie the Minx in the Beano, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So what was the latest comic book? That was the earliest. What was the latest comic book you've read not for this show?
I just read the arc of Star Wars where Chewbacca and C-3PO go to meet the Rock people. If anyone is reading that comic.
I'm not up to date, actually. I read the earliest Star Wars comics and a lot of Kieran Gillen's Darth Vader runs, and he also wrote Dr. Aphra, didn't he?
Yeah, he is amazing. I haven't read, he's done a tabletop games based comic called Die, which I need to read and have not yet read. And I've got the whole of The Wicked and the Divine on my computer, and I need to read that at some point too. I haven't got around to it.
That is excellent, yeah. Also, he did an excellent run on Journey into Mystery, following Loki as a character, a young Loki reincarnated. A very, very good run in Marvel if you are interested.
I might have to look that up. I was not aware.
So you say Star Wars is obviously a focal point for you, but do you have any favourite comic book runs or characters in general?
Yes.
Good. Who are they?
Okay, so other than the ones I've already mentioned, which are like the more recent ones like Ms. Marvel and Ironheart, I love the Champions and Gwenpool. They're great. And Totally Awesome Hulk is quite good.
Yep.
But the ones I haven't mentioned, I remember when I was a kid, I got this huge stack of random comics from a kind of a mini convention I went to, and there was an auction, and I just bid on this big box of random comics. Most of them were rubbish, but two of them were The Fat Ninja and Samurai Penguin, and they were both amazing. They were so daft. The Fat Ninja was on a quest to find the Fridge of Destiny because someone had left the door open and it was making the universe too cold. And I was like, this is just bananas comic writing. So like, yeah, I just remember those two were just completely mad. But yeah, like, other than kind of Ultimate Spider-Man, I don't think... Because most of the stuff I read was that Vertigo kind of style where it was relatively self-contained. I don't remember... Although actually I will say I started reading Hellblazer on issue 222. And that was the last comic I stopped reading. I carried on with that a long time after stopping with the rest of kind of the comics I've been keeping up with. And John Constantine I'm a huge fan of him in various guises. Yeah. Actually, the thing that got me into Vertigo, I'd forgotten until you asked, was the Constantine movie with Keanu Reeves.
Oh, wow.
Which, if you see that movie before you encounter the character, I quite enjoyed the movie, but everyone I've spoken to who did it the other way around detests it. So
yes,
yeah. But one day you'll cover it on this very podcast and I can listen and giggle.
We will. And that will be an experience. And I might get Ian or yourself, depending on if he's back and finished moving by that point, to actually watch the film first before reading the comic book to see what his stance is. Because I'm of the opinion that film is absolute trash. And seeing a character who is meant to be based on Sting, I want to say, a Liverpudlian Sting being played by Keanu Reeves, it's not A1 casting.
So what you have to do is you have to watch the Dune movie starring Sting and then watch the Constantine movie starring Keanu Reeves and imagine that Keanu Reeves should be more like Sting. Yeah. And that will just really cement how different he is from his comic book character.
You could just do that thing where you cut scenes of Sting in various other films into that film and just, get a clip from Quadrophenia, a clip from Lock, Stock, and just cut them all in.
Yeah.
And it would probably still make a better film.
So I will say that Constantine, not a good adaptation of the comics. They don't even get the pronunciation of his name right. So there is that. But I will say that as a movie about supernatural stuff happening in Los Angeles, it is, I think, quite good. The cast is amazing.
It's got Tilda Swinton in, hasn't it?
Tilda Swinton, Rachel Weisz, Shia LaBeouf, which, can't have everything.
Shia LaBeouf was playing exactly the same character he plays in iRobot and just about every other role that he turned up in at that time.
The young plucky sidekick. Yeah, no, exactly. But the cast is amazing. The set pieces are amazing. It's just not anything at all like the comics.
Yeah.
Which,
amazing, though? I mean...
okay, so maybe the set pieces aren't amazing. The cast... The
cast is great.
Tilda Swinton as Gabriel, she's just so good.
Yeah. Which, actually, they've just cast... what's her name? Brienne of Tarth as Lucifer in the Sandman adaptation.
Oh, that's a good choice.
Which is extremely exciting. I can't remember. Gwendolyn Christie. There we go. Extremely excited for that.
Yeah, because it's been done by Eric Kripke, who did the first 5 seasons of Supernatural, also known as the seasons of Supernatural that are worth watching.
I was wondering which ones, because I've seen the odd episode and it's not for me. I don't want to upset any fans of Supernatural out there, because I know there are many and very avid fans as well, but I've only seen the odd episode here and there, and it looked like fairly standard CW fare.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fair to say that it is fairly standard CW fare, but I think the first 5 seasons had like an overarching plot that was kind of intriguing to follow, whereas later seasons were... not quite as good.
Was it like 14 seasons as well?
Oh yeah, I think it is now stopping, but it has been going for a long time.
Because I was kind of thinking it might be like Buffy, which I really enjoyed as a sort of supernatural drama, but it just seemed a bit more frothy than that, a lot less going on. It seemed more like Monster of the Week police procedural, but with some vampires and things.
I think And we're like horribly off topic now, but I think that's definitely a fair criticism of the first season. I think that gets less true as the series goes on. Actually, much like Buffy, which became much less episodic through its run as well.
Yeah, it definitely was in those early days, wasn't it? No, that's fair.
Welcome to the Become the Teapot podcast about Supernatural.
Anyway, you're right. We are massively off topic. There must be a comic book based on Supernatural, but not the other way around, probably.
Yeah, and a comic book based on Buffy as well.
There is. Season 8. I've read it. It was of mixed quality.
Fair enough.
So, those are your favourite characters. In terms of the adapted media, where are you coming from? What is your favourite film or TV show based on a comic book?
Ooh, good question. I mean, obviously there's the MCU. The MCU is fantastic. It would be silly to pretend it isn't. And I hugely enjoy all of the MCU with the possible exception of the first 2 Thor movies. Sorry for any massive Thor fans out there. So yeah, huge fan of those.
Because we've done this on the show before. Bottom 3 MCU films. What would yours be? The 2 Thor films and...
Oh, that's really hard. Probably Age of Ultron.
Oh, wow.
But maybe Infinity War.
Okay. Wow, there's some bold statements there.
Yeah, because I'm one of the very few people in the world who likes the Incredible Hulk movie.
Well, I don't mind it. I just think it's one of the weaker efforts.
Yeah, I think Incredible Hulk's probably in my bottom 5, to be fair.
My other one I dislike is Iron Man 2. I just think it's a real mess of a film.
It's so annoying because Sam Rockwell as Justin Hammer is so good and Mickey Rourke as Man with Whip Person is just not. Yeah. And it's like, focus on the interesting villain. Don't have the random, very bad Russian accent man.
Yeah, he had just won an Oscar, I think, so they wanted to really focus on him, but he was just not an interesting character. And it goes to show, as it's the Constantine effect. A good cast does not make a good film.
That's true. Because I love Sam Rockwell in almost everything he does. And I love him in that movie. Yeah. The reason that's not in my bottom 5 is purely I think Sam Rockwell just does such a great job. But without him in that movie, it would be just not a good film at all.
Have you seen the Sam Rockwell dancing compilation?
No, but you are going to have to link it to me.
Someone's just edited together every clip from a film where Sam Rockwell dances, and it's about a 10-minute long video. He just does it in every film he's in. He decides to do a little dance.
Amazing.
And he's a great dancer. I'll give him that as well. He's got moves.
My favourite comic book adaptation film is a film I haven't read the comic book of, and it is the movie Dread with Carl Urban, which is a phenomenal movie.
It is, and not really based on the comic book that much. The character is there and the characters, but yeah, there's similar story arcs, but not one that's really based on that. Not the Judge Dredd film with Sylvester Stallone, presumably.
I haven't seen that one.
Have you not?
I've been told not to.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother watching it, unless you're a fan of codpieces.
I'm a huge fan. They need to make a comeback.
So I think our listener now knows what your thoughts are, where you're coming from. Shall we move on to Persepolis?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Persepolis, let's start with the comic book. What were your first impressions?
So I hadn't heard much about it other than the title and that it was a movie. So I wasn't aware it was based on a comic. I ordered the book. And the first thing I noticed when I got the book is that it's not comic shaped, which seems like a really obvious and daft thing to say, but it looks like a mass market paperback kind of a book.
Yeah.
And it's black and white comic. And I don't know what I had expected, but it was just a little bit like, oh, okay. And it was kind of 350 pages long, and most of the comics I read are 24 pages long, so that was also a bit unusual. And then I started reading it, and it was a lot funnier than I expected.
Quite a bleak subject matter, and could easily be quite maudlin.
Yeah.
But it is very funny and light-hearted telling of that story.
Well, and funny and light-hearted, but also heartbreaking. Because as a young child living through all of this, there must have been moments of laughter and joy in amongst the kind of the backdrop of what was happening.
Yeah.
And I think she does a really good job of putting you in the perspective of someone who is living for want of a better word, a normal life against the backdrop of a kind of incredible tragedy and political upheaval. And I thought it really made me see how someone lives in that kind of time. It's not all just doom and gloom. And I think she does a really good job of establishing parallels between my experience as like a guy who doesn't have much in common with the author being a woman of color, and I'm a white guy. And so like I thought she did a really good job of bridging the gap between her experience and mine to bring me into her world and give me a way of understanding what it was she was going through.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really, really well done.
Yeah. I think the cartoony style and the black and white nature of it helps with that. Instead of looking at, an accurate rendition of a country that you're not familiar with, you have these sort of interpretations of characters that are immediately familiar because they're not specific, but they are. And I think, not being ultra realistic and having that element of whimsy to it and those cartoony elements does help with that. And I think as well, the cartoony style allows for you to then show those shocking moments, the disembodied corpses and things like that, without being ultra gory or violent. It's a sort of juxtaposition between that light-hearted style with these moments you get of real violence. That's what makes them more impactful than if it was just bleak throughout.
No, and I think one of the moments that really stands out to me is where they're talking about people dying in the war that starts maybe a quarter of the way through the book, and it's interspersed with the author remembering the first time she got invited to a party, and it's the juxtaposition of the humour and the warmth that comes from the author discussing this party, and then the utter bleakness of the discussion of the war and the tragedies that are happening there, and it's all on the same 2-page spread. And I was really taken aback by how good and how easily the author can weave those two threads together. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was excellent.
There's a matter-of-factness about her narration style, which I think helps. It means that whether she's talking about, as you say, a party she went to once, or when the neighbours died in a bombing, it's told in almost the same style. It's that sort of very to-the-point, straightforward, this is just what happened. And the next day, I went and met a boy, and it's just a sequence of her life. There are very few elements in it that aren't about her. I think there's the story about the Iranian powers came to be at the beginning, but other than that, it more or less follows her and the people she meets along the way.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing I would say is, obviously, you talked there earlier about her experiences and how there was still humour and still parties. I think it helps that clearly Marjane Satrapi was from quite a privileged background in Iran. She was obviously from a well-off family. She had a lot of luxuries in that environment that presumably weren't afforded to many other people. I did notice that, we'll talk about this later, they weren't quite as prevalent. They didn't make as big a deal about that in the film as they were in the comic book. They talk about the maid, for instance, in the comic book.
Yeah, I think you're given much less idea about the wider social context in the movie, which I think makes sense because you have less time, but it is something I noticed. And I think you're right to point out, because the author is the great-granddaughter of one of the previous members of the Iranian royal family. So she is kind of coming from a position of privilege, both in terms of wealth, but also in terms of her social context. In a way that makes it easier to bridge the gap to my experience, because obviously I'm relatively privileged in the UK, but kind of compared to the poorest people living in Iran, I've got a lot more privilege. And so I think her being in a position of privilege also makes it easier to bridge that gap between my understanding and hers, and then she can use that to give me more of a context for what it was like. And I think the book does a very good job, I think, of kind of examining and dealing with that privilege, because she talks about kind of her pain and her struggles, but I never felt like she was doing so by implying that the struggles of the other people in the book weren't important or valid. And I think she does a very good job of that.
Yeah. Because it is a personal tale, and she just happens to be the one telling this story. So I agree with you there. I think she doesn't try and hide the fact that she's privileged throughout the story. She addresses it directly to the reader with regards to the maid, the car they drive, all of this. And that probably has a large effect on why she, first of all, survived in order to go and write this story, but also, obviously went off to France and to Vienna halfway through the story, all of which allowed her to be the one in the position to tell the story. It reminds me a bit of, have you ever read Mouse by Art Spiegelman?
I haven't. It's on my list of things I should read, but I haven't got there yet.
It's a similar setup in there. It's about his dad's experience as a Polish Jew in Poland during World War II. And he was obviously from quite a wealthy background as well, and was married into a wealthy family. And a large portion of the reasons that he stayed out of concentration camps for so long and then, survived as long as he did in them is because of the wealth that he managed to accrue prior to losing it all, essentially. So even within these hugely underprivileged society, these areas where they are ravaged by war, there are still people who are more privileged than others. And it's interesting to see how that affects the stories being told, and wondering if we don't quite get to see a lot of the truly underprivileged people within those areas because they never get to tell those stories.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, let's get back to the humour and try and bring the tone up a bit lighter, shall we? So, in terms of the characters, are there any standout moments for you in the graphic novel?
Yeah, I think the grandmother in particular is a character that I really enjoyed and kind of enjoyed following along with. And I really enjoy the main character's parents. I think there's a lot of comedy that comes from her interactions with her mum and dad, which is, it makes a lot of sense that she derives the comedy from her mum and dad, because she's obviously a witty person and she's obviously learned that from kind of interactions with her parents. I also love God. God's a great character.
Yes, he is.
And I kind of like the way she talks about her religion. She clearly is a believer, but she's almost on like a first name basis with God, if that makes any sense. And I really liked the way she talks about that relationship in the book, especially in the last half of the book when she's kind of going to university and things like that. And also every time she just sort of shoots her mouth off in a classroom or a university lecture theatre, she is so brave at points in this novel, and I really enjoy those scenes.
There were a lot of them, of those moments. I do wonder how many of those were embellishments, perhaps. I'm reminded of the old meme of "and then everyone stood up and clapped," at the end of a great moment. And I do wonder how much of that is fabrication or just your memory playing tricks on you about how often it happened. Presumably these were a handful of occasions across many years, so it may have happened, and she was clearly quite a rebellious teenager, so it makes sense that they did. But when you put them all together like this, it does seem like she was just constantly speaking back about things, which you get the feeling that perhaps if she was doing it all the time, she wouldn't have got quite as far as she did. So yeah, no, I agree with you that. I think the Nan is, absolutely a great character. And all of the family, this really sort of liberal Iranian family. And I think that's what makes it all the more sad to see, is this sort of changing of lifestyle for this family in particular. I mean, I'll admit, I wasn't particularly aware of the ins and outs of the Islamic Revolution. I didn't know a lot about it.
No.
I mean, how familiar were you with that area of history?
I knew that Iran was a majority Muslim country, and that, I think, is probably about the limit of my knowledge, really, which is something that is now quite different. I wasn't aware that Britain and the US had conspired to overthrow the Iranian government in 1953, for instance. So that was a bit like, no. And I will just say, in the movie, the French being spoken with an English accent at the beginning of the movie when they tell that part is just so good.
It's amazing, the sort of marionette movement of those characters as well. I loved all of. I mean, not surprising though, is it? I wasn't aware of that, but when they revealed that to me in the comic and the film, was not surprised at all. So...
No, I thought, especially when they said things like they were trying to nationalise the oil, and I'm like, oh right, okay, I see how this happened. And I think actually that made the story more heartbreaking, because I didn't know how it had all come about. I didn't really know how things were going to turn out at any given point. And so she talks about the revolution, and she talks about the period before things started skewing more authoritarian again. Seeing the encroaching authoritarianism and kind of having my heart broken slowly over the course of that. And it kind of reminded me of things that are happening in today's world, especially in the USA. So yeah, I think it was perhaps more poignant reading it without knowing exactly how things were going to turn out.
Yeah, there's a sense of discovery of unfolding events. Adds to the dread, I believe. If you know what the outcome is going to be, which ultimately we do, we've sort of seen it on the news for the last 20 years or 30 years. We've obviously grown up with a representation of Iran in our media, mostly the news, which is very much the one we see at the end of this novel.
Yeah.
So seeing those early days and seeing what life was like for this family before everything changed was a sort of an eye-opener. I didn't know anything about that. It was all news to me, and as such, the story itself that unfolded from there was all the more interesting. I think if it had been one that we were familiar with and one that we see every day, most media we consume in this country is from the UK or the US, and we see those stories a million times over. So seeing these alternative stories and learning about history that we wouldn't otherwise learn, I think that lends it all the more poignancy and all the more drama. I think that's one of the reasons this is probably one of the most widely read graphic novels. It's also one of the most highly regarded, and I think that's largely because it's a lot of people's gateway into this style of comic book. There's the Marvel style, which you said earlier. There's the 24 pages DC Marvel superheroes hitting each other, and I think the reason that these are so accessible, even though they're about something completely different, is because it's almost like a history. It's almost like an education whilst you're reading them. Does that make sense? I feel like I've got off topic there.
No, I think it does. I think this book is clearly aiming to be that gateway for people who do not know the subject matter. I think it's also aiming to be a reminiscence for people who do know the history but want to know how that felt living through it. But I definitely think that the author is, I think, writing assuming that her audience does not have an intimate familiarity with Iranian history.
Yes.
Like, I want to know more about the kind of backdrop and the history now. So I think it's done a very good job of making that introduction.
Well, I think it was published in France in French originally, and so it was for a French audience.
That was something I found fascinating because I knew it was a translation because at the front of the book it says it was translated by such and such, and I was like, oh, okay. But I guess in my head I had kind of assumed that it had been translated from Persian, and then when I watched the film, which is in French, I was like, of course, she went to French school, she spoke French, and this book isn't aimed at an Iranian audience, it's aimed at a European audience. And so it just sort of clicked and I was like, oh, they translated it from French. That makes a lot more sense. But that was something that the film made me a lot more aware of, the kind of way in which the book had been written in a way, which was quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And again, we'll talk about this when we move on to the film, but the transition in the style, like you say, the way that the book is written is different to obviously the film structure that we have. You almost have these sort of chapter markers in the comic, and it's more like a sequence of vignettes of individual stories, whereas obviously with the film they have to tell one ongoing story, which is why you lose a lot of stuff, which I think for me is my main misgiving with the film, is that the fact that we lose so much in a 90-minute runtime.
Yeah.
You know, all these little stories, which I think really are the backbone of the comic.
Definitely.
But I mean, unless you have anything else to say about the graphic novel, shall we actually move on to the film now?
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it.
So what were your first impressions of the film then?
So my first impression of the film was my television saying it was in French and saying it didn't have subtitles. And I was a little bit worried that I was going to need to learn French. But fortunately, the subtitles are embedded in the film. So it was in English, which is good. And as I say, I hadn't quite realised that it was a French language work originally. So that was something that came as a little bit of a surprise. The opening to the film kind of retells the prologue to the book. And as we mentioned, the kind of marionettes of the historical figures and the English accent of the English figure really made me giggle. But I think my first impression of the movie was how much less funny it was than the book.
Yeah.
And I understand that in a book you've got 350 pages and in a film you've got 90 minutes. So you have less time in a movie to kind of go off on those tangents and explore the wider context. And I do understand why they made the decision they made, but I was a little bit sad that there were parts of the book that I had really enjoyed and found funny that had not made it into the movie version.
Definitely. And
also, as we already mentioned, parts about the wider social context, and I'm trying not to spoil too much, but there's a part in the book where they talk about keys that the children are given, and in the movie that is much condensed. And I think in the movie they deliver the emotional impact through film techniques, so they don't need to go into as much detail to give you the emotional grounding. But I was very glad I'd read the book first, because it meant that I had the kind of knowledge about what was happening in that scene in the movie, and I kind of wonder whether I would have felt that was a bit lacking if I had come to the movie first. The animation is beautiful. It's a very beautifully animated movie, and there are some really lovely passages which I think again help that lack of explicit context by making up for it with visual cues, which is obviously like what you need to do when you adapt a book into a movie, so that makes a lot of sense. I think the one thing I will say is that because the author is going into less of the surrounding context, and also because the movie is not told in the first person and the book is, I think the character in the movie is slightly less sympathetic than she is in the book.
Yeah.
I felt less of a connection to her in the film version than I did in the book version, for sure.
Definitely. I think she's less flawed in the film as well. The character in the comic book, it's very much warts and all. It does show these moments where she's done things that are, you know, sort of heinous acts. Getting the man arrested on the steps, for instance, in the film was very much downplayed, and they still showed him ogling her. Whereas in the comic, I don't think there was any indication that this chap had done anything wrong, really. So elements like that, I think the film almost whitewashed some of those elements. And I think missing out on those smaller moments, those, like you say, those funny moments, those moments of banality interspersed with the grand moments. If you cut out the little moments, the small moments that just make up everyday life, all you're ending up with is this sort of overarching storyline. The basic bones are there, but you lose a lot of the depth of character.
Yeah.
And likewise, I say, you lose elements like the commentary on her wealth and class as well. You lose a lot of aspects like that. You would be forgiven for watching the film and thinking that everyone was from that same sort of social stratus. You wouldn't think that there was differing levels and that these people were particularly well off because you're only given the basics. And the comic is so much about those little stories. It's so much about all of the people she meets along the way. The people getting out of prisons, the children, her roommate in Vienna, who just doesn't get a look in the film. All of those things are lost. So although there's more focus on Marjane, like you say, there's less connection to her because you lose the connection that other characters have with her.
Yeah.
I think her parents in particular are a lot less interesting in the film
Yes.
than they are in the comic book.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
The Nan is still great.
Yes. Well, and stuff like in the book, her mum goes to visit her in Vienna, and in the movie that just doesn't happen. And that's a really interesting choice because I think it changes quite a lot of the context of some of the interactions she has during that time. But also, there's a scene where someone is found drowned, which in the movie can kind of work out the rough shape of what's happened, but in the book it actually tells you how that's gone. And I thought in the movie it was weird that they included that scene but none of the context to properly explain it. Ditto, there's a scene in the film with I can't remember her name, but the cleaning lady crushing grapes. And in the book I thought it did a much better job of explaining who she was and why she was uncomfortable with this. But in the film they just have this one scene where she's crushing grapes and you're like, we don't really have much of a connection to her, so why have you've got a joke but you've kind of divorced it from the setup, which is odd.
Yeah, there's a couple of moments like that. I'm trying to remember what the other one I thought of was, but there was one towards the end of the film that was a punchline without the setup.
Yeah.
And perhaps if I had not read the comic book, I would have laughed a bit more at that. But I just thought when it came up, I thought, well, hold on, we haven't had the whole plot line leading up to that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there were very funny moments in the film, and I think the areas of whimsy that make it into the film are probably the best moments. Like we said, the vignette with the history lesson with the English politician speaking French, and also Eye of the Tiger towards the end. The awful singing rendition of that was amazing. And that's something that's not at all in the comic book, completely for the film, but it works really well. Very funny moment.
Just brilliant.
I just wish there were more of them.
Yes, I agree. I really liked Eye of the Tiger, though. And that is something you couldn't have done in the book. So I think that was an excellent way of exploiting the medium of the movie to do something you couldn't do in the book.
Yeah, those janky movements, the puppet-like movements that the characters in the history lesson were doing as well. It's something that could only be done in a moving picture medium. I
will say, the book does not have a framing device. And the movie does have a framing device, which is her waiting at Paris Orly Airport.
Yeah.
And did you understand why they had used that framing device? Because I kept expecting it to be used for something at the end, and then it just sort of faded, and I was a bit like, what's been...
Yeah, I agree. I was expecting it to be her going back for her grand's funeral or something along those lines. I wasn't sure. And then it just, like you say, she gets in a taxi, she leaves. It was completely redundant. And it takes away a lot of the drama as well. You know that this character grows up to be in an airport in the future, so you know that the character is safe because you have seen the end result. I know, obviously, any recent autobiographical piece, they are probably alive and well. But yeah, as a framing device for the film, I just felt it was wholly unnecessary and just there for a bit of colour in the film almost.
Because when it came in, I thought, I guess the movie's going to be in colour. And perhaps the posters I've seen are in black and white to evoke the comic. And then the majority of the movie is in black and white. And I sort of thought maybe they wanted to lull people who don't go and see black and white films into a false sense of security before starting the movie proper. But that might be a bit cynical of me. I don't know.
Perhaps. Also, it would mean that they would have had to have gone seen a film called Persepolis with no forward knowledge, not seen a trailer, and are the kind of people who decide whether to stay in a film or not because of the first 15 seconds. They see some colour and go, right, well, we're staying. Oh, it's gone black and white. Oh, it's too late now. I've decided to stay.
Yeah, that's fair. I did want to say there's one quote from the movie, and I don't remember whether it's in the book, but I wrote it down in the movie, which is in the last half of the film, she's talking to her partner who is kind of saying, we could go and live in Europe. And she says, in the West, you could die on the street and they'd walk right over you. And I thought that was a really interesting quote, and I'm going to spoil part of the second half of the book and movie, Teapot listeners. So please avert your ears if you are excited to see this. Skip forward about 30 seconds, it'll be fine. But in Vienna, she does almost die on the street.
Yeah.
And someone finds her and takes her to hospital.
Yes.
So I was a bit like, that isn't true. It might be that she says that in the book, but I think a good example of how much you feel divorced from her when you're not in her head in the book is that in the movie that felt really jarring. So I was like, but that your experiences in Vienna were not like that.
Yeah.
And I did wonder whether it kind of evokes the duality of the character almost, because she spends much of the kind of early part of the book in this country which is being ravaged by war, and then she goes to Europe and initially like, yes, she's made it out, and then she kind of really misses Iran and goes back. I did wonder whether that was the kind of duality of she wanted to belong in Iran because she hadn't enjoyed Vienna, and she's trying to rationalize that somehow at this point in the movie, but it just stuck out to me as a kind of weird moment.
Yeah, I noticed that moment as well. I completely agree with you. It's a strange thing when we've already seen evidence to the contrary for that statement. And there are moments, particularly in the comic, where the character is shown to be a bit of a hypocrite from time to time, who her views do change across, sometimes from panel to panel. But I don't think this was intended to be one of those moments. I think it was meant to be a straight reading of what the character's thoughts were in that moment, which, considering, as you say, we had already seen something to the contrary earlier in the film, just seems strange. Like you say, it takes you out of the moment. I also felt that the treatment of her first husband in the film was a bit unfair, where in the comic book we learn a lot more about their relationship, and it seems, again, spoilers, it seems more like a mutual thing that they're both aware of early on in their relationship, once they get married, that it was probably a mistake. Whereas in the film, it seems almost like that character becomes instantly negligent and, ignoring her and watching TV. It seemed like a strange change. But again, I think these are just for time constraints.
Yeah.
I think they have to streamline a storyline in order to make it fit within a 90-minute framework. And I think by losing a lot of those smaller elements, the more nuance in certain characters, you lose a lot of the humour. And you, as you say, you lose a lot of the heart as well. You lose a lot of the empathy that you feel for the main character. Don't get me wrong, I still really enjoyed the film.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I will say, so on Letterboxd, I rated it 4 out of 5. And on Goodreads, I rated it 5 out of 5. So it is kind of, you're going from perfect to still really good. You're not
yes.
Like we're talking about, we're focusing on the differences, and most of those differences are things we dislike. But when I don't want to make it sound like I didn't like the movie, because I loved the movie, but I really loved the book.
Definitely. I think if I hadn't have read and then watched in such close proximity, I would have enjoyed the film a lot more. I really liked the film. But sitting there the whole time, you're thinking, oh, why have they cut that? Oh, why have they missed out that bit? I really liked that bit from the comic book. That should have been left in.
Yeah.
Why have they changed that? I have recently joined Letterboxd with you. I saw your review, your 4-star review, and I held off on reviewing myself because I didn't want to spoil it. But I agree with you. To be honest, 4 stars is about where I'm going to sit this. As you say, the comic book to me is, for that subject matter, a near perfect rendition of that story. I can't think of anyone telling that story. I mean, not least because it's Marjane Satrapi's story, but that style of story any better. I think that's really well done. It's funny, it's informative, it just hits all the right emotional beats all the way through. Whereas I think the film just has a couple of those little stumbling blocks, which, as I say, I don't know if there's more to do with the fact that I've just read the comic and those things are actually lacking in the film, or if it's just by contrast. But I still enjoyed both.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with you.
So, I mean, we're already kind of wrapping up anyway. This is my questions for the conclusions are, which did you prefer and why? So we've already answered that question, but would you recommend them to people?
Yeah, definitely. I have told my wife that she should read the book. I'm very glad that I tried to find an ebook version of the book, and I tried to borrow it from the library, neither of which was possible, so I bought a paperback version. And I'm very glad I did, actually, because it means I can lend it to friends and kind of say, you should read this, which I am glad about. It also turned out that renting the film on my video platform of choice was only 50p cheaper than buying it, so I also bought the film, so when friends come over I can kind of show them the film as well. And I think I'm going to try and show my parents it when lockdown is over, because I think they might really enjoy it. And most of my film taste leans quite heavily into science fiction and fantasy, neither of which are things that my parents enjoy. So this is a film that I can show them and they won't be like, why are you showing us this, John? This is rubbish. So yeah. But no, I absolutely would. I'd highly recommend both to anyone. I thought they were fantastic.
Yeah, completely agree. In fact, in 14 episodes of doing this show, this is the first comic book that I've managed to get Hayley to read prior to recording the show. So it's something I think that has a universal appeal. Even if you think you might not be interested in this, I think the approach to things, the humour, can just about appeal to anyone. Like you say, you can recommend it to your friends or to your parents.
Because it's a story, even though it's a story that's in a social context that really vanishingly few of the people I would recommend it to have, it's a story at its heart about childhood and about relationships and about finding out who you are and finding out how to make that work in a society that does not want you to be that. And on some levels, those are things that we all go through. I mean, obviously, the author here has a much harder time. I had a very easy life and I am not at all trying to pretend I haven't. But I think still, there are so many parallels and there are so many ways in which I can sympathise with the character, especially in the comic. And so I would say that I'm sure there are people who will dislike it, but I think there's so much here that will speak to anyone, I think, that I would really thoroughly recommend it to anyone.
And what order would you perhaps recommend people, the graphic novel and the film? Would you recommend that they watch and read both, or do one and then the other, or one or the other? What would you reckon?
I think if someone comes to me and says, I'm going to do both, which order do you recommend? I'd say book then movie. If someone came to me and said, I'm looking for a movie recommendation, I'd probably recommend them the movie and then try and sell them on the book after they'd seen it. Because it's a lot easier to say to someone, do you want to sit down and watch a movie tonight, than it is to say, here is a 350-page book. I expect you to have read it by the next time I talk to you. So, I mean, maybe my friends are just wusses. I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, that was my approach for this podcast. That's basically what I said to you, wasn't it?
That is true. That is true. I hadn't thought of that. This podcast is just an excuse for you to make Ian read things.
Yeah, I say that at the beginning of every episode.
You do, but I hadn't realised how true it was until just now. But no, I think it is much easier to recommend a 90-minute movie to someone. So probably just from the basis that I think they're more likely to go for it, I might do the movie first. But if you're going to do both, do the book first, I think. What do you think?
No, I agree with you completely. I think the film is a lot more accessible to a lot of people. You can pop it on and as you say, it's not a huge commitment, 90 minutes. And then if people enjoy it from there, great, go and read the comic. But if you are already interested in this as a subject matter, then absolutely pick up the comic first. And then I would say the film's great, so watch that as well. But if you're going to do one or the other, read the comic.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too.
So I think that's about it for this week, unless you have any other business.
I don't think so.
Well, in that case, that is all for us this episode. But John will be joining us again next episode for more Become the Teapot. In the meantime, where can our listeners hear more from you?
So I do 2 other podcasts. I do a podcast called Octothorpe, which is a podcast about science fiction fandom in the UK, which, if you want to listen to that, then please do come along. We do have some listeners who listen to us who are not in science fiction fandom in the UK and allegedly enjoy it, but I don't know how. So, yep. And I also do a podcast called Watch This, where I play Arkham Horror the card game on my own. So if you like the sound of that, then also look that up.
And we'll throw some links in the description for those. So if you want to follow those, you can check them out. But thank you again for filling in for Ian this week, and thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed Persepolis and are interested in reading more autobiographical comic books, then there is a whole wealth of options available to you. There's Blankets by Craig Thompson, Relish by Lucy Nisley, Palestine by Joe Sacco, They Called Us Enemy by George Takei and Justin Eisinger, and of course, probably the most well-known and as mentioned earlier, Mouse by Art Spiegelman. Whatever your interest might be, it's more than likely that there is a book out there that will appeal. If you want to get in touch, you can drop us an email on becometheteapot@hotmail.com or tweet us at becometheteapod. You can also find us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe on your preferred listening platform. As mentioned earlier, John will be joining us again next episode while Ian completes the world's longest house move. And in honour of Falcon and Winter Soldier releasing on Disney+, we'll be revisiting the early days for both characters as we watch Captain America: The Winter Soldier and read the first 14 issues of Captain America Volume 5 by Ed Brubaker. Until then, thanks for listening, stay safe, and read more comics. Hello and welcome to Become the Teapot. I'm Ian.
And I'm not. Shit. Fuck you, Watch. Sorry. Well, that's an inauspicious start. I should have turned the
great.
bings off. You want to go again?